Everyone, welcome back or welcome to my channel if you're new here. My name is Lamia and you've caught me in the midst of my interning at the UN series. This is the third video in the series. So today I'm doing the very anticipated video on my UN internship interview experiences, plural, because I've done more than one. It is currently raining in Harare, so if you hear any white noise, you're welcome. Also, I thought, you know, what better day to wear a hoodie, and then I thought, you know what, I've got just the hoodie for this video. I hope you appreciate the little attention to detail. Okay, so I'm going to split this video into two parts. In the first part, I will be speaking about my UNICEF internship interview, and then in the second part, I'll be speaking about my other UN internship interview. I am deliberately going to keep the second UN agency anonymous for good reason, but really, you know, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference whether you know which agency it was or not. So hopefully that doesn't bother you too much. So I'm actually going to divide each part into 4 sections. So first and foremost, I'm going to talk about the advice/instructions given. Secondly, I'll talk about the interview format. Then I'll discuss the questions I was asked. You're welcome. And lastly, I will share with you the questions that I asked. So in my previous video, Being Delusional helped me get my dream internship at the United Nations, I actually read to you verbatim the email that I got to basically say that I was shortlisted and invite me to the interview. Of course, after that, there was a lot of communication, a lot of confirmation of times. I remember, so they'd given me a time, and it was obviously New York time since it was, you know, with UNICEF headquarters in New York. And at the time I was in Harare, Zimbabwe. And look, I don't claim to be good with numbers. In fact, I'll tell you for free, I'm really bad with numbers. And so what had actually happened, oh, this was so embarrassing. I'd basically miscalculated the time zone difference, and so I was like, yeah, okay, I'll be ready for 6 p.m. my time. I received a response to say, no, I've actually just checked, you know, and it turns out it's actually 5 p.m. your time. And I was like, that could have been disastrous. In that communication, I was also given some really helpful advice, which I would be more than honored to share with you all, because I thought it was so considerate. So basically, the first piece of advice I was given was focus on what you did specifically, because apparently lots of people waste time in the interviews talking about group work. Secondly, I was, you know, advised to wear anything that I felt comfortable in, which my mom thought was hilarious because I know today is not a very good, you know, example of this, but I'd like to dress formally anyway. Like, my aesthetic is mainly formal. The third piece of advice I was given was to preferably have my camera on and not to worry so much about my, you know, background on Zoom. I was also advised not to worry too much if I was interrupted at any time. I was told that it would just be, you know, to make sure that they had time to get to everything in the 30-minute interview. And then lastly, something I think I will carry with me throughout my professional life, they mentioned that the last 10 minutes of the interview would be reserved for any questions that I had. Reason being, they wanted to ensure that the interview was a two-way thing. Let me break that down. Just as they were trying to decipher whether or not I was the right candidate, they wanted to ensure that I felt that they were the right organization for me. Okay, so there were 3 panelists and they all kind of started with self-introductions. There were 2 from UNICEF and 1 from ITU. Okay, so this is clearly the point in time where I have to stop being so vague about the specific initiative that I interned for. So basically, the initiative is called GIGA, and they basically aim to connect every school in the world to the internet, and it's been existing since 2019. And they've just, like, their numbers are so impressive. All that to say, it's actually a joint initiative between UNICEF and ITU. So obviously to them, you know, they had thought about how essential it was to not just have UNICEF employees present in this panel, but also to make sure that there was somebody from ITU, which I thought amazing. That is so cool. And then, of course, in my previous video, which if you haven't watched, you really should, I mentioned just how blown away I was by the diversity of the panel. And this isn't just diversity in terms of race, it was, you know, diversity in terms of field, diversity in terms of gender, nationality. And, you know, having worked with the team, you know, I was able to realize very quickly that that was no coincidence. They are very intentional about making sure that everybody is represented, and that, you know, to use the UN's terminology, nobody is left behind, and also to make sure that everybody feels very welcome. And I did. So I was probably asked questions, give or take, for about 15 minutes, and basically basically, I would say that each panelist asked 2 to 3 questions. So they kind of took it in turns. Like one, panelist would ask me one question, they'd move on to the next one, and then the next person. And then, of course, like I mentioned, the last 10 minutes were reserved for questions that I had for them. Okay, on to the juicy part, questions that I was asked. These are the ones that I remembered off the top of my head. I really should get into the habit of writing down the questions the minute I put down the call. But basically, the first question I was asked was why UNICEF, why Giga. The second question I was asked are, what are your strengths? I was also asked to talk them through my creative process. By this point in time, they knew that I had a podcast, so they kind of asked me about that. I was also asked how I manage my time. And then I was also asked if I have any suggestions for their website and social media feeds. And I think this is probably the question I spent the most time elaborating on. And I thought it was a fantastic question. Just obviously because in doing my research for the interview, I'd obviously, turned their website inside out. So of course I had a lot of notes and pointers on how they could improve their social media feeds and their website. And then onto the even juicier part, the questions that I asked. So I asked 2 questions. So for me, the way I prepare questions to ask, I pretty much have one rule, and that for me is, should I not be selected for this position, what is the one thing I would really love to know that I now have this opportunity to gain insight on that I otherwise wouldn't? So the first question I asked was so stereotypically Gen Z of me. I basically asked what a typical day in the life as a UN employee looks like, especially because at that time we were approaching the UN General Assembly. So I wanted to know specifically what the weeks leading up to UNGA week looked like for them. And then the second question I asked was how they decided which schools to connect. I wanted to know whether it was based on how feasible it would be to implement the initiative into a specific country, or if it was based on the actual need of the country. And I just remember being so satisfied with the very elaborate response I got on that. Having done so much research on the countries that had been connected at that point in time, Zimbabwe being one of them, I was just so keen. I was like, who okayed this? Who confirmed this? Did they just throw a dart on a map? You know what? We should start this in Zimbabwe. And I was so happy that I finally got, an answer on that. I was very satisfied. It was one of those things, like I'm mentioning, to me, it was the one thing I needed to know in the event that I would not be continuing with them. Okay, and now I'm going to talk about my second UN internship interview. So, keeping the format, any advice that I was given. Actually, I wasn't given any advice for this interview. I was just given a date, a time, and a Zoom link. And I know that this sounds very minimal compared to what I received from UNICEF, but I actually think it's standard to just receive a Zoom link, a time, and a date. But, having worked with my supervisor who was communicating with me at that time, I think I can now say it was probably something that he did on his own individual accord to just, go the extra mile to give more advice to make, all the candidates feel as à l'aise, relaxed as possible. And the interview format for the second UN internship interview was pretty much the same. I think it was about 30 minutes as well. This internship was split into 2 parts. So the one part was communications, and then there was another department. So basically the intern would be doing both. You would essentially be an intern for both departments. So for this interview, it would be both supervisors, one from the comms department and one from the other department. So there were just 2 panelists. And basically when they both got onto the call roughly at the same time, they both didn't have their cameras on, and of course I had my camera on. I was smiling and waving, and then a few minutes in, they were like, we can see you've got your camera on, but feel no pressure to, you can switch it off if you want to. And of course I had no intention of staring at myself for 30 minutes straight, so I switched my camera off. And of course it really brought down my nerves because I was really nervous, of course. So essentially they took it in turns. The comms supervisor asked me all of her questions, and then we moved on to the other department supervisor. And then of course at the end I was welcome to ask any questions that I had of my own. I would say it probably took 30 minutes, the same as my UNICEF internship interview. Onto the questions that they asked me. They asked me what comms assets I'd done in my UNICEF internship that I was proud of. They also asked how I handled any disagreements I've had in the past with my colleagues. They also asked how I handle my time. That seems to be a really popular one. And then of course they asked logistical questions to do with my location and also my education plans. The questions I asked if the content and the communications assets that I would be creating would be for their main social media accounts, or if there were other country office social media accounts for this agency. I also asked for a rough estimation on the timeline of one of their main project proposals that was mentioned on the terms of reference. It kind of seemed a bit tongue-in-cheek considering I hadn't really been selected for the internship yet, but I also just wanted to know. Again, like I said before, it's like the one thing I want to know in the event that I don't get selected. But to conclude, I really think both interviews were fair for an internship level. I will say that my second interview was a lot more difficult than my UNICEF interview, which was a lot more general. However, for my second one, I also did an edit test, and that's a major clue into my next video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.